Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're diving into what has to be one of the most uniquely bizarre, whiplash-inducing technical debates you're ever going to find online. We're looking at a piece directly from Mircea Popescu's blog Trilema, and we're unpacking a highly technical argument about web architecture. But, what makes this specific source material so fascinating isn't just the code itself. It's the absolutely wild, contrasting narrative the author uses to set up his thesis. Let's just get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. The author, Mircea Popescu, kicks off his essay not with a line of code, but by detailing this highly unusual, incredibly provocative weekend. He actually frames his entire deeply technical thesis around a massive, multi-day shopping spree. He tells us that through every single bizarre activity of his day, his mind was totally preoccupied with one specific, highly technical thought. And honestly, to fully grasp the sheer comedic contrast here, we really have to look at what exactly he was up to.
Right, so the source lays out this chronological escalation, and it is a wild ride. It kicks off at 8 a.m. with absolute mundanities. Getting his car's drivetrain calibrated, buying a spare wheel. Okay, normal enough. But by 11 a.m., he's at an unmarked location getting electronic keys copied by a guy running a black market op out of his house. Cut to the afternoon, and the shopping trip drastically escalates into buying massive glass jugs, pharmaceutical Vaseline, paddles, and dog collars. And finally, by 6 p.m., he is publicly walking women on leashes through a shopping mall, dealing with the tense, blushing reactions of the mall workers. He goes completely out of his way to describe this shocking, libertine afternoon in super vivid detail. And yet, the narrative immediately turns around and asks us, what profound thought was occupying his mind during all these extremes?
He was thinking about serving HTTP. Yes, really, serving HTTP. This is the hard pivot of the essay, and this jarring, almost comedic contrast is entirely intentional. On one hand, you've got a weekend filled with deliberate public humiliation, wild purchases, and rule-breaking personal behavior. And on the exact opposite side, an incredibly dry, rigid, and deeply conservative focus on web protocols and software dependencies.
So to really understand his obsession here, we need to quickly define the core subject of this explainer: the LAMP stack. For anyone who might need a quick refresher, LAMP is a traditional software bundle that has literally powered the web for decades. It stands for Linux as the operating system, Apache as the web server, MySQL as the database, and PHP as the scripting language. It is the absolute old guard of the internet. And Popescu? Well, he has some incredibly strict rules about it.
The source outlines what we can really only call Popescu's dogmatic web rules. First up, he states that serving HTTP is simply unavoidable for the foreseeable future. Because of that, he argues Apache is the inescapable server, and he actively dismisses modern alternatives, like he outright calls Nginx a useless piece of garbage. Third, since MySQL comes essentially free with the LAMP stack, it becomes the inevitable database. And finally, PHP is the inevitable scripting language. His fiercely conservative stance here is that, look, sure, you can choose to write your programs in Python or Bash or whatever else, but PHP, it's still going to be sitting there in your system as an unavoidable dependency. You literally cannot escape it.
Which brings us to his core philosophical point. He argues that, yeah, you can stray from the minimal proven LAMP stack, but it won't be a substitution. It's going to be an addition. You're just piling on dependencies. As he puts it, venturing outside this proven stack comes at a cost, and that cost is an extra helping of madness. He is deeply, deeply concerned about passing on massive technical debt and brittle infrastructure to future developers who are inevitably going to have to maintain these custom, non-standard setups.
Section 2. The Philosophical Symposium. The commenters push back.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that the blog post itself is only half the story. The comments section here is not your standard random internet chatter. It honestly reads more like a high-level Socratic dialogue between these distinct technical schools of thought pushing back against Popescu's rigid rules. We immediately see this from a commenter named Stanislav Dotskovsky. While Popescu's stance is essentially, hey, just do it all in PHP to avoid dependencies, Stanislav points out a major functional limitation. PHP cannot physically write a continuous process like an IRC bot because it just doesn't support continuous sessions. In fact, Stanislav successfully built a working, stable logger using Python in the Flask framework in just 6 days, really challenging the whole idea that PHP is the only valid path forward.
So across this entire debate, we see three distinct competing web architectures emerge. First, there's the legacy LAMP stack, which Popescu relentlessly defends as the only true minimal set, even if he fully admits it's unpleasant. Next up is the Python pivot proposed by Stanislav, using Nginx, Postgres, and Python/Flask. Popescu heavily critiques this one. He claims Nginx is useless and Flask is just comedically bad. And finally, there's the Lisp gamble, brought up by a commenter named Spiked, which relies on Apache and a Lisp server called Hunchintoot. Popescu dismisses this one entirely, basically arguing that Lisp is a terrible language for processing HTTP text.
Let's zoom in on that Python and Flask debate for a second. Stanislav argues his case with hard evidence from his own infrastructure. He notes that his Python/Flask setup has run completely stable with 0 issues since 2013. He also pushes back hard on the Apache requirement, pointing out that he doesn't even have Apache installed on his machines. But Popescu, he completely refuses to yield. He insists that depending on a framework like Flask is an atrocity of epic proportions and an errata of insanity compared to just using the tools that are already built into the core legacy server.
And then we get this brilliant moment that reveals Stanislav's ultimate counter-argument, the number 20. He points out that he has run Linux for 20 years without ever once using PHP for his perfectly working applications. From his perspective, this completely proves that PHP is not intrinsically welded to the operating system, which goes directly against Popescu's almost Aristotelian view that Linux is fundamentally designed to run PHP.
Section 3. The Lisp Alternative, String Munging, and Hunchintoot.
So, as the Python debate kind of reaches a stalemate, we move to the next challenger in the comments, the Lisp programming language, championed mostly by the commenter Spiked. Now, the core of this argument really comes down to processing HTTP text, which developers affectionately call munging strings. Popescu argues that the entire object domain of port 80, serving web pages, is literally just munging strings, and that Lisp is a terrible tool for that exact job. He even challenges the Lisp advocates to rewrite some incredibly messy PHP regular expressions just to prove it. But Spiked pushes back, arguing that Common Lisp, at its absolute worst, is only exactly as bad as PHP for text manipulation.
But here's the catch. Even the Lisp advocates have to make some pretty big concessions when it comes to their actual server architecture. A Lisp server named Hunchintoot. Spiked completely agrees with Popescu that a server like Hunchintoot should never be trusted to serve HTTP on its own, naked on the open internet. And why? Well, its thread per connection model is highly frail. It's simply not battle-tested enough to survive malicious traffic or DDoS attacks without the hardened, battle-tested shield of Apache sitting right in front of it to take the hits.
Section 4. The database hole. MySQL versus Postgres. So, the crucial point is when commenter Diana Coman shifts the focus away from scripting languages and zeroes in on the database layer. She points out how these components fit together by default. She notes that Apache actually does not automatically force you to use MySQL. In fact, she runs machines with Apache and Postgres where MySQL was never even installed. She also argues Postgres might technically be superior for string searches. And surprisingly, Popescu actually concedes this. He agrees Postgres might be better, but he argues that the Apache stack comes with a database-shaped hole, meaning your stack is implicitly going to use a database, and MySQL is just the default historical path of least resistance. Choosing anything else is adding a non-standard dependency.
After pages of this intense, highly technical debate, Spiked reaches a pretty grim realization. He states, "In other words, it seems to me that there's no choice other than between atrocious etas. Basically, whether you're relying on the nasty buffer overflow-prone C code of Apache, or you're dealing with the massive, brittle dependency tree of a modern Python Flask app, every single architectural choice is a compromise. You are always dealing with terrible code."
And this leads us to the broader, honestly somewhat apocalyptic realization of the group, this concept of genusizing. To picture this, imagine archiving or preserving a Genesis state, literally freezing a software stack in amber. The commenters share this pervasive belief that modern software development is actively degrading. The goal, they argue, isn't about finding the best or most elegant programming language anymore. It's about finding the most resilient, time-tested, minimal stack and freezing it, literally preserving a legacy 2011 Gen 2 Linux LAMP environment for the future. It's the harsh realization that picking the smallest possible set of tools isn't about preference at all, it's about sheer survival in a decaying digital landscape.
Which brings us to the ultimate question at the very heart of this source material. Knowing what we know about the fragility of modern code, is it better to just stick with the intolerably unpleasant but historically proven legacy LAMP stack, or do you risk that extra helping of madness required to build something new, modern, and potentially unstable? It's a really profound question about the hidden costs of our digital infrastructure, and definitely one worth pondering. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the foundations of the tech you use every single day.